One, two, three.
Perfect.
Welcome. It is wonderful to see so many folks here in the auditorium, and of course, we have another set of folks joining us online. And it's again, it's great to welcome Dr. Jonathan Samet here. It's a delight to be with us here today, and of course, also last night. He's going to share his presentation, which has a question in it, which is always good because it's always thought provoking. And we launched this Dean's Distinguished Lecture Series about 2 years ago now to highlight research topics that integrate efforts by multidisciplinary teams. And as we know, biomedical research, it tends not to be done by one person or even a group expertise in one domain, but it's more like a team sport, we say. And, there's cell molecular biology, epidemiology, systems biology, all kinds of omics, et cetera, all that come together to make sure that we can do impactful things, impactful science. And this lecture series, his intent is to bring us together to help engage, whether it's faculty, students, residents, fellows, and to hear lectures by the most eminent folks in their own field and discipline, and to learn how this multidisciplinary work can make such a difference. And again, these lectures have led to insights. It's allowed us to come together as a college, and I know there's many fruitful collaborations even I see coming out of the time we spend together at these lectures. So again, I'm so grateful for everyone being here, and particularly Dr. Samet. With that, I get to introduce the person who's going to introduce one of his mentors and teachers, which is Dr. Jerry Krishnan. And many of you know Jerry, but just to say, he is professor of medicine and public health, as well as being associate vice chancellor for population health sciences. He's an affiliate faculty member for the Center for Global Health and the College of Pharmacy. So he's a member of many colleges. Critically, he's a physician scientist who has expertise in many things, including care delivery science. He co-founded the Institute for Healthcare Delivery Design. And in his spare time, he delivers expert care to patients with pulmonary disease, including asthma, COPD, and long COVID. So with that, Jerry, you're up.
I think Dean Rosenblatt wasn't kidding. Some of you know that I see patients. Dean Azar, good to see you. Some of you know I see patients 1/2 a day a week, and my wife, who's a physician full time, says I'm barely a doctor. So that's the way to bring a husband down to earth, So I have really the great honor and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Jonathan Samet. I have to tell you, if you've looked him up on the web, there's just an immense amount of information. And so what did I do? I put in ChatGPT, can you summarize John Samet in 100 words? And it said no. So I now have this. So, but I think you'll learn why it's difficult to summarize Dr. Samet in a short number of words. He's done a lot, and I'm hoping that his visit here today spurs us on to also think about how to really aspire towards impact and collaboration and interdisciplinarity. So Dr. Samet is a pulmonary physician and epidemiologist. He's the past dean of the Colorado School of Public Health and professor of epidemiology and occupational health. Previously, Dr. Samet held leadership positions at the University of Southern California, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which is really where I met Dr. Samet, and the University of New Mexico. Dr. Samet received a bachelor's degree in chemistry and physics from Harvard College, an MD degree from the University of Rochester School of Medicine and Dentistry, and a Master of Science degree in epidemiology from the Harvard School of Public Health, the other School of Public Health. His research focuses on the health risks of inhaled pollutants. So if you breathe, you should care about the research that he does. Okay. So he thinks a lot about particles and ozone and outdoor air and indoor air. So the air right now, I bet he's doing a study right now of the air, including secondhand smoke and radon. He's also investigated the occurrence and causes of cancer and respiratory diseases, emphasizing the risks of active and passive smoking. So for those of you that think a lot about environmental tobacco smoke and passive smoking, you have Dr. Samet to thank. For several decades, he's been involved in global health, focusing on tobacco control, air pollution, and chronic disease prevention. This is like 3 CVs worth of work. Dr. Samet has served on and chaired numerous committees of the National Research Council and the Institute of Medicine, also chairing the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, of the US EPA and FDA's Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee. He has served as an editor and author for reports of the Surgeon General's on smoking and health since 1984, receiving the Surgeon General's Medallion in 1990 and 2006 for his contributions. He received the 2004 Prince Mahidol Award for Global Health, awarded by the King of Thailand, and the 2006 Public Service Award from the American Thoracic Society. He was a senior scientific editor for the 50th anniversary 2014 report, and was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 1997, where he also received the David M. Rall Medal for his contributions in 2015. On a personal note, Dr. Samet was my PhD advisor, and I can tell you it's a very, very, how shall I say, intimidating experience having him as your PhD advisor. I remember the first time I met him, I walked out of his office thinking, I've got a lot of learning to do before I come back to the next meeting. But really, he's been an inspiration to me, and I think many of his mentees and advisees all over the country. So with that, I'd like to offer a round welcome and round of applause to Dr. Don Samet.
So thank you, Jerry, for the nice introduction. Mark, Prab, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. You know, you said I had to shorten my talk, and then you took 10 minutes of it and expended it on reading my obituary. And so I don't know, I'm going to think about this very carefully about how long I'm going to talk. The other problem that Jerry does worry about is that he thinks for some reason that every encounter with him is a continuation of his PhD defense. So there may be a question launched his way. So when I was asked to give this talk, I thought a lot about what I wanted to say. And this question of sort of looking at evidence of what we know because we want to do something. And then this question comes, then what do we really know? And it's useful to think about that and how we say, okay, here's what we know, and here's what I would like to know. And that's sort of where we focus research, of course, but we always have to make decisions. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to present a version of the world that really doesn't exist, in which evidence leads in a nice way to action. But we're going to use that artifice because it's helpful. Well, let's see, am I failing already? Ah, all right. All right. We'll keep going. Anyway, so if evidence and uncertainty were what we needed to make decisions, we'd say, okay, we know this, we don't know that, and we have to make a decision. Notice I put bedside. So when you're at the bedside and you have to make a decision, you have to act, perhaps in certain situations. You can't say more research is needed, more information is needed. I'll get another test when somebody's bleeding out. You have to do something. So I think this sort of paradigm works in that simple case. But then when we move on to the real world, we have evidence, we have uncertainty weighing against it, and then what I would refer to as a lot of other stuff. And in the world that I live in trying to translate science into doing something, it's easy, and everybody knows that economics figure in, politics figure in, where people advocate for and against figure in. And there's a lot of powerful voices in our society, in our world, that influence where this scale goes. So what we do is pile up evidence, and I'm going to talk about how we make those piles, and then we try and gauge what the level of uncertainty is. So here is our start of our problem. We have a big problem. We have too many papers coming out, and trying to capture what it is we actually know has become a major challenge. So here we are, the pace of scientific papers It's hard to find an exact number, but it seems to be that more than 1.5 million papers are coming out in biomedical research per year. I tried to get the citation frequency, and it's somewhere, I saw one estimate of each paper is cited 0.75 times, maybe 1 to 2. Okay, so we're generating a lot of stuff, and we have to sift through it to figure out if we really know something. So Jerry mentioned that I work on air pollution. So one of the important things that's driven more progressively stringent particle standards in the air has been the finding that air pollution exposure is associated with increased risk of dying. So good idea, we should lower particle levels and live longer. Here is the cumulative number of papers on air pollution and mortality to now. So we're up at about 10,000 just on that. One of the seminal papers from the Harvard Six Cities study was 1993. We began to work with very large national cohorts, maybe 20 years ago. And this number just keeps going up and up and up. And the systematic reviews help. So here's the cumulative count of systematic reviews on air pollution and mortality. So notice we're up now to about 450, 500. So if you sitting there playing with PubMed or something and say, bring up the systematic reviews, your problem is not solved. They're trying to understand what it is we know. So I don't know. You know, I was a good internal medicine resident, so I used to get the Annals of Internal Medicine, and I actually read it. The New England Journal of Medicine. Does anybody here get hard copy journals still? It's kind of an ageist question, sorry. But so not so many, okay? And probably for searching, you do a search and then poke through and try and get enough. So we're in a different era. Some terminology, evidence, what we know, ignorance, what we don't know, uncertainty, which clouds decision-making as a consequence of ignorance, okay? And then there's doubt. And of course, now we're in this era of manufactured doubt and misinformation in our sort of post-truth world. So we have lots to contend with. I'll highlight the book on ignorance. It's a small little book written by a neuroscientist at Columbia who teaches a course for undergraduates on ignorance. And, you know, he highlights the importance of knowing what you don't know. And this quote I pulled out of the book, ignorance then is really about the future. It's the best guess at where we should be digging for data. So defining that and judging your uncertainty is a challenge. Now, here's your first quiz. All right, anybody in this room, so true or false? Caleb Williams, who is now the quarterback for the Chicago Bears, making enough money probably to support a whole medical center, played for USC. His number 13 has been retired by USC. True or false? I see stunned faces. You're not reading the sports section? False? Are you certain? Who said false? And why did you say false? Have you read it somewhere?
No, but I think I know enough about it.
Let's say it's too soon to retire enough.
So if you his number is retired, your dean got it right. His number is retired. Okay, so here you are. You're willing to go out on a limb in public and say true or false. You know, so how certain do you want to be? And that, you know, that goes back to decision making fundamentally, which is why I'm torturing you with Caleb Williams, who's not had his first two games have not been very good, by the way. So let's get out of this stuff. So how do we know when to take action on something? So here's my made up world. So I'm proposing if the world were really rational and linear, we'd have a question, we'd seek to generate evidence about it, we would do research, we'd pull the evidence together, we'd do some evidence synthesis and integration, and then we'd take what we know and decide what to do, and sort of laid out down below in the blue, you know, some of the critical steps along the way. And we're going to wander through this over the next 2 hours, Jerry, and reach talk about how this works. So I'm going to give you an example where I think this actually works. So I got involved in tobacco control because you couldn't study anything about the lung and not contend with the effects of smoking. If you look at this plot, this is cigarette consumption per 18 years and older in the United States across the last century, which Alan Brand at Harvard said was the cigarette century. And notice the peak is 4,000. So that's 200 packs per year per person in the United States. Okay, that's incredible. And then here's this decline and some of the major events that drove it down, like the 64 Surgeon General's report, and then on into when we raised prices, secondhand smoke came along. So I'm going to use this as just propose that this is an example where this paradigm worked. Now, it took decades. It wasn't like something was published in 1950 that said smoking caused lung cancer. The government said we better do something about this and let's ban cigarette smoking, right? So it took a while. A seminal event, and this was gathering the evidence. And I think, in my mind, one of the earliest systematic reviews was the 64 Surgeon General's report. And for those of you in public health, if you haven't read it, read it, at least read the first part. So this is the press conference when it was released. There's Surgeon General Luther Terry. Here is the advisory committee that did it. Notice the ashtrays, okay? And Louis Fieser was my organic chemistry professor at Harvard. Infamous, he invented napalm, among other things. Cochrane was a distinguished statistician. Len Schumann was the epidemiologist on the group, and they were picked as a group that did not have strongly expressed opinions about tobacco. So here's the methods of the report. They had a plan. They made the information available. They actually reviewed over 7,000 papers. They judged, they evaluated each paper. They looked at the interpretations of the authors and the conclusions of the committee, and they developed the criteria for causal judgment. How do you decide that smoking causes something? It was a real point of tension in public health and medicine at the time. And in fact, the couple of systems, if you will, for looking at evidence for deciding about causation date back to that time. So one set that we talk about that many of you have probably heard of came from Sir Austin Bradford Hill, published a paper in 1965. If I were picking on Jerry, I would ask what was the other important thing, among the many important things that Sir Austin Bradford Hill did. Any takers? For the first randomized clinical trial, streptomycin tuberculosis, 1948. Okay, so you can debate about when the first trial was, but he did that as well. And then for the Surgeon General's report, another set of criteria came. Around this decision-making, Hill said, you don't know everything, you're never going to, but you have to move forward. So then the Surgeon General had this set of criteria. And between Bradford Hill and what's in the Surgeon General's report, these remain embedded in decision-making everywhere. And so these have had lasting impact. Also in the Surgeon General's report was this table that pools the results of 7 cohort studies. It's actually a meta-analysis, again, done before we were describing that term. When we came out with the 2014 anniversary report, this was in the New England Journal based on that table, and it's a forest plot of the results. So this was Cochrane, and this was pioneering. So a systematic review that led to powerful conclusions. Smoking causes lung cancer in men. Importantly, the committee said this, okay? Need to do something about this. He didn't say what to do. And this is, again, that divide between saying, here's what the science shows, and then any number of steps could follow. Just last bit from tobacco. So this is the 1986 Surgeon General's report. I was one of the editors of this is our team going to see Surgeon General Koop, who lived on the NIH campus. This is the report. This is all the lung cancer and passive smoking data available. This is the first conclusion of the report. Involuntary smoking is a cause of disease, including lung cancer, in healthy non-smokers. That sentence has powered smoking bans here, and around the world. And so, the power of a causal conclusion, not to be underestimated. Probably, if anybody smelled tobacco smoke today, it was on the streets. In Denver, there's equally likelihood that you'll smell cannabis smoke, tobacco more likely, probably, in fact. So the world was changed by science, and this drop continued. So let's go back to my framework and talk for a minute about each of these steps. So the first part is getting what the question is that you want to answer. And again, that's obvious. When we teach young researchers, we say, come up with a question. We say things like this. It should be addressable. There should be a clear counterfactual. Smoking causes lung cancer. Counterfactual, smoking does not cause lung cancer. It's very specific and be testable. And address some gap in the evidence, fill in some bit of that ignorance that you want to take care of. It should pass the well, so what test, which means once you have the results, will anybody care? Taught to me by a colleague in New Mexico, I asked to participate in a project. She said, well, it passed the well, so what test? And I was a little astounded because I didn't know about this important test. And what did I learn? Well, it's got to be important. And I think that's right. And it's not this sort of stuff, which we put in grants. Little is known about the causes of whatever. In spite of decades of research, here we propose a study to better understand the causes. That's not a testable question. Okay, and I'll give you an example of formulating the questions right. So everybody remembers the days, right? Washing the grocery bags. Maybe you left your groceries sit for 24 hours before you dared to touch them. There was the peril of the doorknob, and masks, yes, no, etc. Same time, we had things like the Skagit, Washington choir practice, where almost everybody got infected, because what better way to generate lots of small aerosols shooting to the back of this room than to sing? So in August of 2020, I put together a workshop at the National Academies on the question of airborne transmission. It was a hot topic. We had 15,000 attendees remotely. And the point I want to make about the questions is we had a paradigm going from sort of the source, people, out to getting an infectious dose and getting sick. We laid out questions that needed to be answered. Okay, and we formulated those in a precise way so that we would have answers. And so here are the answers that came out of this. And, the dispute at the time was the role of small particles, which are not the ones that you sneeze on your neighbor and drop to the floor. But they're the ones that are very small, and they'll stay suspended in the air for 4 to 6 hours or more and reach the back of the room or get sucked up into the HVAC system and moved around. So we, at the end of this, by formulating the questions right, we came out with answers that I think made a difference as things were pursued. Then there's this question of doing the right research. And, again, for those who do research, there's the immediate reward of getting funded, and then there's getting a paper published, and then you're at the so what point, right? And so if you're at the so what point, you want to have done consequential research. And this came out of the Lancet from 10 years ago now, and it describes these quadrants of relevant knowledge and relevant to application. And sadly, too much work falls into the not in advance in knowledge and not relevant. And ideally, at least in public health, many of us are down here in the Dahl quadrant named after Sir Richard Dahl. And so question is, how do you get research in there that's relevant? So part of that is understanding what's important to decision making. You know, there's always that bit in the grant where you write about impact and say, you know, this advance in knowledge will lead to, and then you list out a bunch of things. So the question is, how do you do research? We'll list that out. I'm going to give you an example. And again, a personal one. I'm going to apologize for talking about so many personal examples, but here we are. So in 1997, we passed the fine particle PM 2.5 air quality standard, the first one. And this came about at a time of great controversy about whether we needed the standard, whether the evidence supported it. I was at EPA workshops where, you know, there was fear of violence, I think, with the way that people were talking about this. The law passed. Those of you know there was a Supreme Court case, Browner, American Trucking et al. Versus Carol Browner, head of EPA. I was called right after all this and asked to chair a committee for the National Academies because Congress had asked for EPA to do the right research. And we had very little time to set a national research agenda. And what we did was develop a paradigm, a framework shown here. And then on this, we outlined the key uncertainties. And the unique thing about this was that the funding committees, House and Senate, told EPA they had to direct their research according to this, even how many dollars were to be spent. So, you know, going back to this fake scheme I made up, whoops, back to here, we want research that in the end will lead to action. So we had a unique opportunity in this case to do it. Then we generate the evidence. We have to find that evidence, which has gotten easier. So I don't know if anybody remembers wandering around the library with a big cart. Anybody ever do that? Ageist question. And you know, I used to do that when I was a fellow. I'd go to the Countway Medical Library and pile up the books, the volumes, if I could find them, and then take them back to some carrel and sit there. Sometimes I even invested 5 cents a page in copying them, but it seemed awful expensive. And you know, then you could do a National Library of Medicine search and pay $30 or whatever it costs and get back green bar paper with references. And what do we do now? We've got all these search tools available. And we certainly couldn't deal with that 1.5+ million articles without it. So then we have to evaluate the evidence. And again, in the old days, you could read a bunch of studies, make a table of them and say, well, in my opinion, study number 1 is really good and study number 5 is not so good and whatever. And you could write a review article. Just couldn't do that now. And if you know, had some imprimatur in the clinical world and you were a key opinion leader, people would believe what you said, maybe rightfully. And that was the process. So now in evaluating evidence, you know, we have to look at risk of bias. Who's done a systematic review here? Okay, so it's not easy, is it? It sounds so easy. You get all the articles and evaluate them, right? Wrong. And so there are all these systems like GRADE, Cochrane, and others. We have tools for evaluating systematic reviews. And this is like, it's a bit of an industry because there's so many that have to get done. And then if you deviate from the rules, you're told you deviated from the rules, which is bad. And then it's tough. So, and I will say I've been involved in some challenging situations around applying these tools to areas where they don't really fit. And then it's a problem. We had a big fight developing the WHO air quality guidelines for a year over methodology. So this is an important step. And again, I think now that basically the state of practice is if you want to do a systematic review, you need a systematic review sort of expert to do it. Do you have a systematic review shop at USC? Yes, no, Jerry, do you?
The library.
The library could help you, but you don't have a systematic review group or an evidence-based practice center or no. Something to think about. So moving on down the line, there's this whole process of evidence review, synthesis, and integration. Okay, and then here you're going to line up all the studies, and the integration step may come with something like the causal criteria or something else to say what it is we know. Now, here is a pop quiz question. The Cochrane Collaboration is a global group that does systematic reviews, has the Cochrane Handbook, etc. For a substantial prize, I'll pull up my wallet. Well, for whom is the Cochrane Collaboration named? The easy shot, yes, the last name is Cochrane. So that would be cheating. Anybody know? Do you? Okay. All right, so here, remember this, if you take away anything from here, you know about Caleb Williams' number. Now you're going to learn about Archie Cochrane. Okay, so Archie Cochrane was one of the original respiratory epidemiologists. He took a sabbatical to evaluate the National Health Service. And he said, we've implemented this national health care system. What has it done? And he wrote a small book worth reading called Effectiveness and Efficiency. By effectiveness, he actually said what he meant with the word we use now, efficacy. He said, too many things we do, almost nothing has been evaluated by a clinical trial. And then he talked about what he called efficiency, which is effectiveness. What happens when you move things into practice? And if you read his book, he's a really interesting man. He talked about equity and the need for equity. So a little book still available. So some terminology, systematic review, bringing together all the evidence and evaluating it. Meta-analysis uses statistical methods to summarize the results, like that table I showed you from the Surgeon General's reports. And then there's all kinds of other reviews coming along. An umbrella review is an overview review of systematic reviews. Okay, just think about that. And then pooled analysis is bringing in data at the individual level and doing a pooled analysis from all the studies, instead of a meta-analysis, which takes the summaries from the individual studies. So systematic review, schematically, you have to have a question, you find the papers, you review them. And, again, the rules here are pretty rigorous. 2 people doing each evaluation for risk of bias and dealing with their disagreements, and then doing an evidence synthesis, piling up the stuff, and integrating it. And then having things come out. And you might do, and this has become what you have to do in this process. It's actually in regulatory processes. So if you look at the reauthorization of the Toxic Substances Control Act, or Lautenberg Act, 2016, it says systematic review will be done. So here is another little piece of trivia. Any takers on this one? What? Glass. Let's give Glass the credit, but Smith and Glass, fair enough. Let it go, Robin. Okay, so the interesting thing is this was coined by Gene Glass. He probably used it first in an address in 1976. The point I want to make is Glass was in educational research. He was not in medicine. Medicine was really a late comer to systematic review and meta-analysis, starting probably late 80s with Ian Chalmers, Tom Chalmers, and others. So medicine was late to the game. Glass, actually, interesting paper, he writes about this guy, Ising, another complicated story, said that psychotherapy didn't work. He put together all the evidence and said, and this is his plot, I won't go into it, he said psychotherapy does work. And this went on. So here's what he talks about this. Statistical analysis of a large collection of analysis results. So a really important idea that spread, this is simply the network analysis analogized to the Big Bang. The other way to bring evidence together is to bring the raw data together. And this is a group of principal investigators for cohort studies of underground miners. This picture was taken about 1992. We convened this group to bring together all the data to look at the risks of radon. And it led to this risk model, which is still basically how EPA describes the risks of lung cancer associated with radon. Then after this comes this evidence integration causal step. And this is critically important. And that conclusion, writing involuntary smoking as a cause of disease, when you write that stuff, you know that there are implications. Smoking causes lung cancer. Air pollution shortens the lifespan. So this is the step where those decisions are made. And then you hope that action follows. And again, example, the Clean Air Act, which puts a heavy mandate for public health on the administrator to propagate standards that protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. And EPA has a well-outlined scientific process shown here. This comes out of the preamble of the documents they put together. So if you notice, it really does. I didn't make all this up. It starts over here with peer-reviewed science through a bunch of steps of evidence gathering and synthesis and analysis, in the end, to a standard. Okay, and this process under law, it takes 5 years. Okay, and it has to be transparent. It has to be airtight because there's inevitably litigation that follows. Okay, so there's an example of this. So just now, a few other things. So what if the process doesn't work? And I'm going to turn to one example that I've been involved in now for more than 10 years, which is how EPA, in its integrated risk information system, evaluates the risks of chemicals. And I chaired a report committee that said EPA had done a very bad job in assessing the risks of formaldehyde. What was wrong with the process? Process didn't work. So we ended up moving forward with redefining the process by which EPA put evidence together, leading, of course, to yet another committee and another. I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but sometimes you have to fix what the process is. Okay. How am I doing on time, George? Could I have 5 more minutes? You took a long time with the obituary, so. Okay, all right. 10 more minutes. Okay, so I want to talk. I'm from Colorado, so I have to talk about cannabis. Okay, now I'm going to show you a press release from your governor's office, July 10th, 2024. Governor J.B. Pritzker announced today that Illinois reached $1 billion in cannabis retail sales on July 1st. Way to go, Illinois. Okay. And so, here we are with this. 24 states now have legalized cannabis. Who knows, by now it's 25, but in any case, far larger number have medical access. So what does this mean for public health? Okay. Has anybody been in a dispensary in the last 5 years? If you were to, way to go. You have to go in, don't you, and see what's there. So in Colorado. So if you walked into a dispensary, here are some of the things you might see. You might see edibles. You might see various concentrates that people heat and breathe in the smoke. You might see a vape pen that delivers 70 to 90% THC right into the lungs of your teenager. Okay, so, and the potency of flower has gone up. It's probably around 20% now on average. This is marching up. This is through 2010, but our estimates now say somewhere around 20, 30%. The people who know about marijuana growing say probably 30% roughly is the ceiling with breeding to get to. And then all these concentrates and edibles. So when I was dean of the School of Public Health, House Bill 211317 was passed. It had a bunch of things in it, a bunch of provisions, one of which said the dean of the Colorado School of Public Health, I was in that unfortunate position, will undertake a systematic review on the health consequences of high potency marijuana and THC concentrates and develop educational campaigns for the public. So what did we do? We did a scoping review. That means we scanned the literature for everything that might be relevant. And you might notice up at the top 66,000 records we started with. Okay, and talk about AI, we used an AI tool for screening these after we had it trained. And we produced this evidence map. For those of you who are interested, there's a QR code. We've made all this work available. We hope it's going to be used. We spent a fortune in doing this scope of review. The problem with the review is we didn't find much relevant literature. So if you were seeking to do evidence-based work on these products, we didn't find much. Why is that? Because the marketplace is changing rapidly, just like the tobacco marketplace. And today's products have not been studied yet. We don't even exactly know who's using what. So even our public health surveillance mechanism is breaking down. So I'll just continue the story for a moment and raise the question, what do you do if the research is inadequate? Okay, so there's all these terrible studies. So what we did, this is 2 months ago, we convened a group of the nation's experts, including bringing in the National Institute for Drug Abuse, NIDA, and said, let's develop what we need to get done around at least assessing what people use. So we have proceedings that we're just finishing up. We've also have published commentary, just coming out as this one, on this gap between our governors. Our governor loves cannabis too, $200 million for education. I challenged our governor and said, well, what about the health effects? You know, state legislature is concerned. So I think this is just an example of trying to think through the problem and how to get the right information into that framework I showed. So the other piece of this is that for those who want to slow or deter action, essentially this framework provides a playbook. And Rob and I know this too well from the tobacco industry's playbook, which has been so widely adapted to assuring that evidence-based action doesn't proceed. You know, starting with you've addressed the wrong question, to attacking the research, or actually doing research and putting it into the peer-reviewed literature or not, discrediting the evidence through one or more ways, attacking the processes. So when we were doing the passive smoking work long ago, Philip Morris and tobacco industry generally actually supported studies saying why you could not do meta-analysis for secondhand smoke. There are what I've called dueling systematic reviews and meta-analyses on different chemical agents, where there's one out of the academic side and there's one out of some Beltway bandit group that has done their own systematic review and meta-analysis, surprisingly with different conclusions. And then, of course, there's opposing the action. In the case of secondhand smoke, my friend and colleague at Hopkins, Tom Burke, and I wrote about this some years ago now in the American Journal of Public Health, and just went through how the industry turns epidemiology upside down to attack things, including saying the method is weak. What did the tobacco industry say in 1964 publicly? Oh, these are just associations. Okay, you don't have a mechanism. So, you know, again, this went on, and I mean, it went to the point of many, many people hired, secretly, unsecretly out there attacking the science, creating scientific societies and journals around indoor air quality, the harassment of researchers. A lot of this, my colleague at USC, Anna Wu, and other universities went through massive subpoenas on their data on lung cancer and passive smoking. So this was not pretty. And of course, in the end, the industry was found guilty of fraud under the RICO standard, the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act created for organized crime. This is Judge Kessler, who heard the US DOJ case. I actually testified in that. I had the easy job of saying what the science shows. If you want to read something that I think tells a great story, read the Kessler opinion. It's 1,700 pages, and it's actually remarkably cohesive and well done. So, take a look. So again, I often think that those who want to attack things do it with some organization. Again, that tobacco industry playbook. There's, I think, one of the most powerful sentences that Judge Kessler wrote. I think she died within the year, actually, and did a remarkable job with this. So, we're at kind of a pivotal moment in the election cycle. I think everybody knows that. And I've thought about writing sort of a World I, World II editorial where you wake up with one person or another elected and think about what it means for public health, the environment, perhaps for medicine. We wrote this piece at the start of the Trump administration. And, it says, heed the science. Here's a sentence out of it. I guarantee you my friends read it. They wrote, what a great piece. It's exactly what I would have said. So that was not who we were writing for. And I can tell you in my interactions with the Environmental Protection Agency during those years, they were really interesting, to say the least. There's other things going on that I think are important in this process. This attack on expertise, and going back to the Big Lebowski, the dude always has something to say, and just like, it's your opinion and there's mine, and your opinion's based on that systematic review and all those papers, but that's just your opinion. So finishing up, I'll just comment that how can you give a talk right now without talking about artificial intelligence, AI? So this is Wade Hampton Frost. He was the first academic epidemiologist, first chair at Hopkins, 1918. Notice that thing in front of him? Everybody knows that's a slide rule. And one of our senior faculty used to torture doctoral students when they were defending, saying, what's that stick in front of Wade Hampton Frost, which of course none of them knew. And then there's the Hollerith card, okay, originally developed 1890 census, and of course, what some of us had for our data. And then the HP programmable calculator and other things we used. I'll point out, I actually read this book in medical school, John von Neumann's book on the computer and the brain, short little book, published in 1957. Go read it. He anticipated so much of what is happening, laid out the conceptual framework. So, we'll see. And again, machine learning being applied to systematic review. These are two recent papers, an editorial from my Colorado colleague, Tanjing Li, the heap, the hype, the reality, generative pre-trained transformer for systematic reviews. So hopefully, Jerry, ChatGPT will become a help eventually. So I'm done. And I think this is going to be an ongoing story. And, I'm sure that we are at the start of a paradigm shift, and there'll be another and another and another. And let's hope it helps us do our job of going from science to action better. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Good. Okay.
Amazing talk. um, how one person's work and dedication and commitment can fundamentally change the health of the society and perhaps have global impact without any doubt. John, thank you very much
Thanks,
for
Bob.
all you have done and for the terrific lecture. So let's give him a big hand of applause. And we have 5 to 7 minutes to take some questions. Anybody has a question for Dr. Samet? Yeah.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation, John. Appropriate for the protection of public health. That's the guidance for a lot of regulatory decisions. You think we can get there with cannabis? And where would you put your values
Yeah,
of how to advance a regulatory framework
yeah.
for that?
Yeah, so I have a great question. And we did the systematic review. We sent reports to the legislature and we got a little bit of the, so what? So you've told us that we don't know anything, but you haven't told us what to do, which I think is what you're getting at in part. And so we followed up actually with a policy analysis. We did a landscape exercise on what other states are doing. And part of the problem here, so one question that we have been asked repeatedly is, can you name a concentration threshold that you should not exceed in products? And the answer is, it probably won't work. Why? Because you lower the concentration, what do people do? They puff more, or they eat more, or they do something more. And so I don't know if concentration limits, maybe it's a step. And maybe if you have to work harder to get intoxicated, that works. The other big problem here, of course, is the Schedule I classification of marijuana. And that is a problem. So it's certainly hindered research. And that's an issue. It may affect our ability to do epidemiological studies and get valid information on patterns of use. So, it's I sometimes will analogize back to 1913 when Camel cigarettes were launched and say, are we launching something else again? Because I know there's some of you are concerned with sort of life course epidemiology. And think about it, exposure can begin before birth, particularly mothers who are using. We know that that happens. We know that there can be, passive exposure, breastfeeding, for example. And then, once kids hit the teenage years, the peer influence, accessibility, it's a real challenge. So I don't know where we're going to go with regulation. And of course, for the short term, your governor, my governor, see a revenue stream. And of course, the cannabis industry, many players have come into it with big expectations about what they're going to make. And you have big players. I mean, I don't know, how involved in this will big tobacco become, for example. So I think right now, at the least, we need to build the infrastructure for better real-time surveillance. And the same thing is happening with cannabis has happened with the current tobacco marketplace. Things change fast. New products are brought in because they up sales. And those of us who are doing public health surveillance don't have a clue about what's going on. The research inevitably lags. If you really think about the writing the grant, doing the research, publishing the paper, there goes a decade. And then people say, hey, that's not relevant anymore. And so I think we have a real challenge. What we've tried to do is highlight the challenge and at least say we've got to develop better tools. I'll credit Colorado for putting up the money to do something. And we're launching a public health campaign directed at adolescents and pregnant folks. So we're doing things now that we've tried to do that are evidence-based, but and some states are struggling with, and some are just saying, hey, we've got a lot of new revenue source.
Hi. Very inspiring, very thoughtful. Nowadays, we're thinking that bigger and bigger and bigger is better. If you look at our EPIC databases and all of these huge data lakes
Yeah,
and how
yeah,
many
yeah.
hospitals and countries can we bind? Because that's going to give us, AI is going to answer it all with bigger and bigger data. But the question is it, when you talk about meta-analysis, you're talking about so many different studies. What was the data? How was it acquired? What's the quality of that data? So the question is there some sort of asymptotic size versus quality that needs to go in so that you can, or is a small study better? An N of one we talk about in clinical medicine. If I can get that one patient better and I see a benefit. So where are we going in terms of our thinking, in terms of, so we can make decisions about what to do with that next patient that walks in? What should we do? Is these huge data sets can answer the question, or is it smaller, more focused, and maybe better quality studies?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I think about all the time. So and I'll stick with the air pollution for a moment, then I'll come back to your comment about Epic. I think we had the first grant to use Medicare to sort of create synthetic cohorts for air pollution studies about 20 plus years ago. And my colleague at Harvard, Francesca Domenici, has continued using 70 million Medicare recipients, assigning air pollution exposure based on address location. We have folks in the European countries, like, Denmark, Netherlands, where they have these national registries and could do the same thing. I'm to take your comment to an extreme. Soon we'll have global cohorts, and when you have everybody on the planet, what do you do with what you find? I think that there's an incredible challenge in interpreting these studies because small, perhaps unimportant things can emerge that are statistically significant, and you're left with the struggle of saying, gosh, is my model misspecified? Well, of course it is. Every model's wrong. Has that led to this? Do I respond to it? Do I act? The use of other administrative databases, so your Epic database for here, well, presumably you can learn a lot from that about the populations you serve. And then how do you separate out the noise? And I think that's a real challenge. And I get sent a lot of papers to review where I think people are reporting on the noise. And then in follow up to the last bit of your question there, do you, when you find something, then have to nest in some more refined, smaller study with data that you can control the quality of and hone in on something specific? So maybe we're going to have a new model. I certainly don't think we're there yet. And, when I look back to stuff that people were writing 10, 15 years ago about learning health systems, precision knowledge, even precision public health, targeting populations, we've got a long way to go still. And I think we have to unleash these tools carefully.
I will take one last question before we adjourn.
That was so fun. I took a lot of pictures of things I need to read. So the problem that we have in my field is that despite high quality evidence, despite reliable meta-analyses, on the receiving end, you're dealing with a consumer. And that consumer doesn't know how to digest information, and nor do the providers necessarily know how to take an odds ratio, translate it into a number needed to treat, and understand how to translate that science into real world numbers for the individual patients. And I think that accompanying this call, we need to better educate our consumers through some creative means.
Yeah.
And the science of that in this social media environment is very complex.
So I'm just going to agree. And, there's certainly lots of people who worry about the issues that you talked about. And, we've been talking about science communication, educating the public, whatever, forever, right? And we haven't made much progress, and our new tools of social media have just made our challenge worse. And, in the tobacco field, and, Robin might comment, but it seems to me we actually need real-time surveillance for all the false messages that are reaching potential users and somehow oppose them. When I was at USC, I had one of these Tobacco Center of Regulatory Science, this huge center, and we had a then postdoc, now faculty member, who was a computer scientist. And I remember sitting with one night for a long time and him wising me up about the 21st century and bots and the false generation of information. I was sitting there just sort of amazed because he was developing algorithms to sort out real from unreal. And I know you're absolutely right. And, you could take, let's take a terrible example, vaccination. And the erosion of trust in vaccination, in spite of their significance, in spite of, measles outbreaks, you can name it, or the opportunity to keep from dying from COVID. And yet the misinformation somehow holds sway. Now that goes back to the politicization of science, et cetera, et cetera. And, but it's very disturbing. So I think a different question, which I would pose to you, is how do we as health sciences centers, practitioners, researchers address this problem? And that's a challenge. And yet another National Academy report or something doesn't get us where we need to be. So yeah, no, I totally agree. And these alternative facts, oof, what an idea. We have one.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah, right there.
Pauline, that was an incredibly, this is something we are all going to struggle with, this idea that there are islands of facts or opinions and we can't tell which is which. So about a week ago, John, we held a national long COVID summit at UIC with attendees from throughout the country, Department of Health and Human Services, ARC, NIH, and others. And what emerged, and the topic doesn't matter, but it was a sort of a important comment made by representatives of affected communities of COVID, is that essentially they were telling us that it's not just the message, it's the messenger. That we need people in our communities to be amplifying what it is that you as scientists are developing. And so maybe that's a role, I think, certainly for UIC, given who we are and given our mission, that we should be developing messengers to be the bridge between facts and action. And obviously not a small point, but I think this was directly coming from the community, saying we need to hear directly from people like us. So I think, I don't think the solution is going to be more and more technologies and better forest plots and better ways of detecting bias. I think we're going to need to figure out how to raise the floor, if you will, of people who can engage with us. So thank you, John.
So we'll continue the discussion at the reception, one floor down in the faculty alumni lounge. John, what can I say?
Well,
Thank
so
you so
thank you
much.
so
It was
much.
just
Thank you.
phenomenal.